Welcome to Curb Enthusiasm. I'm Emily Weidenhof.
I'm Jason Banrey.
Today, we're talking to Skye Duncan, Executive Director of the Global Designing Cities Initiative, which is focused on transforming streets around the world and developing international street design best practices.
Prior to her current role, she served as a senior urban designer at the New York City Department of City Planning, collaborating with multiple agencies to make New York a more resilient, livable, and healthy city.
Welcome, Skye. So wonderful to see you. A true globetrotter, always a different time zone when we connect. Thanks for joining us all the way from the Southern Hemisphere.
Oh, you're most welcome. Great to be here.
So you work for Global Designing Cities, recently celebrated a 10-year anniversary. Tell us about the initiative and what you do there.
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, again, thanks for having me. This is so awesome and really happy you guys are doing this podcast. I've listened to a bunch of them already and they're great. They're kind of really inspiring for a lot of us who geek out on streets, not only in New York City, but around the world. So it's an honor to be here. And particularly speaking about some of our work at GDCI, as you mentioned, Emily, we're now 10 years old, which is awesome. And today we're about 40 staff, I think now in almost 20 different countries around the world. And so we really work to help cities ask what's possible of how that kind of space can serve more people. And we work directly, we've touched down in about 70 different cities around the world. We literally go out and paint the streets in the middle of the night. We get projects on the ground to show them what's possible. And then we help the cities scale that for the longer term systemic change through, citywide programs, policy updates. And all of that work is based on our core guidance, which is the Global Street Design Guide. We've got just over 130 cities, regions, and organizations around the world who have endorsed that. So a similar process to the NACTO guidelines where they produced it like by cities for cities, and then the states endorsed it, the cities endorsed it, and ultimately, central government or national government started to update their policies as well. And then we've done a suite of other resources. One of my favorites, Designing Streets for Kids. But at the end of the day, it's really all looking at, our streets as the heart of our cities and how we can rethink that.
Fantastic. Super exciting, super impactful. I'm glad you mentioned Streets for Kids. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But if I were to ask you again what you do, but explaining it to a classroom of 5-year-olds, what would you say?
It's such a cool question. I'd say, as a kid, you guys, every day you are kind of out on the street. It's your space, right? You can't drive, but you can scoot and you can walk. And this is a space that if you look at it and reimagine, what would you want the space to be? And absolutely, what we realize is you do not need a master's degree to tell us this stuff, right? You talk to a 5-year-old and they can tell you where they feel freaked out crossing the street or their favorite corner to stop and play and have a conversation because something engages them, or to pause and smell the flowers. And we do a lot of kids engagement where we ask them to tell us what do they want to see in the space.
I'm curious, as a new dad, how that new work has really translated to changes throughout the world. You work internationally, and so curious, what are some of those patterns that you've seen specifically with children, right? Are children actually asking for specific things in their streets? Are they saying specific things and have specific requests?
It's pretty similar across the globe. I mean, when you think about it, streets are essentially our largest network of public space, right? And this trend of kind of wasting that space or kind of capturing that huge untapped asset is global. It really doesn't matter like what language we're speaking or what color our skin is or what our accent is. I mean, this is kind of consistent across the world. We need to be designing our streets through that lens of children. And when we do that, we're making it great for everybody. But we're also acknowledging that these guys are, they are our future. And they're so vulnerable in the sense that they're not just little adults. They actually have different, diverse needs that, as people who are shaping streets and making decisions on a daily basis around how we design it, what we fund, it's really critical, right?
Oh, yeah.
what we know is the science for early childhood development, for the brain to develop, is that you need to have low stress to build important and kind of meaningful connections with a caregiver. You need to have lower stress levels. You need to have opportunities for learning and opportunities for meaningful conversation and connection. And so it's important to think about the needs of the kids, but also for the caregivers who are with those kids.
Right.
And so many of the streets you see around the world, there's no chance a parent's going to pause and have a meaningful conversation or play with their child because they're terrified that that child's going to survive when they're walking down the street on the roadbed or trying to cross a street that has no crossing with, speeding vehicles coming at them.
And just curious, because I've seen how our work has changed hearts and minds here and improved children's lives, and especially through COVID, some of the open streets and the program that we developed with your work, Emily, has really transformed and improved kids' lives. So just curious, when you do that work and those kids partake in that work, what's it like for them, and what do you see in their faces when they're enjoying the product of that work?
It's hard to describe because it's such an intense feeling of joy to see on the kids' faces, but also on their caregivers' faces, on their parents' faces as well, that those smiles, those twinkling eyes when you see, previously kids that have been, holding on to their parents' legs, as they kind of come out of school or into the school, and instead, they're running free, they're climbing on furniture. There was an amazing project in Milan that we worked on. We've been working there for a number of years now, actually, with Jeanette Sadakhan and Bloomberg Associates, helping them kind of kickstart a Plaza program, very much inspired by New York City. And there was one project outside a school there in Spoleto. And firstly, they had a great competition where the kids got to compete to name the new plaza that was there. And so awesome. the child, we've got these great photos of the kids standing up with Plaza of Dreams. And it's like, how amazing is that, right? Like no adult or engineer is going to come up with a name like that.
Oh.
But it's also those stories and the moments that you capture seeing. I've got this amazing photograph of a new mother with a newborn, like tiny, tiny little baby standing there in the middle of the space, and all the neighbors are kind of, standing around to meet this latest newborn baby. And that's when you kind of sit back and go, we kind of did something pretty cool here, right? Like the fact that that person comes out feeling comfortable in a space to bring one of the most vulnerable, stages of life to that space is just chalk and cheese, black and white to what it was, previously, literally, again, like car parking, speeding vehicles, and parents standing in a roadbed.
Yeah. So you guys do an amazing job of showing incredibly transformative before and after photos, like you're saying, just incredibly powerful projects that people can immediately feel the benefits. You do an amazing job kind of communicating a lot of the work in graphics and in the street design guide. That said, change is hard. And it's not always as easy and as beautiful as you make it look. Could you talk about some of the challenges that you face in creating these projects?
Yeah, the pictures are great, and thank you for the compliments on that. We try really hard, and again, a lot of inspiration from New York City DOT from the early days. This stuff is never easy, right? We've got the pretty pictures at the end of the day, but I think, as you guys know, I don't think there's been a single project that, we haven't been screamed at or spat at or, some form of, verbal, luckily not a ton of physical abuse, but it's really hard. It's really, really hard to do this stuff. But I think a couple of things. One, we do try and take a bit like you guys, this kind of interim approach sometimes to getting change on the ground and actually showing people what's possible through human experience versus asking them to understand the implications of that through looking at a drawing on a piece of paper, or on a screen. And that kind of interim approach really does help, I think, lower people's fear of change, because you've got that tagline of like, we can put it back, we can bring it back if it doesn't work. So, we do a lot of engagement previously before the projects, but also during the interim interventions or the pop-ups or whichever version makes sense, to gather people's feedback and to collect that data, both, again, the numbers, the stories, the feedback, so that we can shift from kind of anecdote to analysis. Because again, I think globally, we are always going to see people screaming and yelling and pushing back. But the reality is that generally that's not actually representative of the largest majority of people. They're the loudest,
Yep.
but not representing the majority. And so we find that, when you can kind of acknowledge that, but bring the data to the table, you can have a fairer and more equitable conversation around what makes sense moving forward. This is public space, it's public money getting invested. We need to make sure that this finite space we have in our cities is serving, the most amount of functions and the most amount of people that we can. And I think one of my favorites is actually finding those people who are converted and having them come and help you on the next project.
Yeah, exactly. I think we see that all the time in our work.
Day.
We may be able to deliver some data, some analysis, the kind of city perspective, but it's never really us convincing neighborhoods that this is a project for them.
That's correct. And I love that you mentioned converts, and I got goosebumps when she did that, just because we've seen converts, and we're inviting converts over to our meetings now and just empowering them to speak to their neighbors. And it does make a difference. It makes a huge difference when you get that buy-in from somebody, especially someone that didn't really enjoy the process. But then they're gifted with something that they see themselves in, and they kind of carry on that conversation. It's amazing.
Yeah. And you guys are the masters at that, right? Like, you've now got over a decade of doing this work. I mean, gosh, almost coming up 2 decades, right, of doing this work. So you've now kind of done that transformation on the ground, that you've built that local demand. And I think that's a very similar kind of trajectory or long-term vision that we're trying to help cities get to. They're often at the very early stages of that. But I think even as city governments, I remember chatting to Will Norman, one of the deputy mayors for walking and cycling in London, and he was saying how they found like local plumbers or local business people and actually gave them media training and got them to help tell the stories about these types of changes, plazas, cycle infrastructure and so forth. For that same reason, I think particularly the business owners is a really important and hard kind of nut to crack, right? Like, when it's people's financial livelihoods that they feel like you're threatening.
Right.
So I think it's really important in this work that we're doing. We absolutely want authentic community input and engagement in the process, but we also cannot strive for 100% consensus. I think that's a mistake that we make too often in cities, because it's literally impossible. We are never going to get 100% of people on board with something.
Hey, listeners, we hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. For those of you who are as enthusiastic about transportation and planning as we are, we'd like to hear from you. You can submit topics and questions that you'd like us to cover at nyc.gov/curb enthusiasm. And now, back to our conversation.
Talked about this before, and I think it's touched on it being a story of reclamation, right? A lot of what we're doing is reclaiming public land and giving the public an opportunity to say, hey, how do you want to see this? And so are there other notable stories that you can share when it comes to stories of reclamation?
Yeah, one of my favorite stories of reclamation, it's from quite a few years ago now, but it was like very impactful for me. We were working in Addis, Ababa in Ethiopia, and we'd done like a kind of intensive training with a bunch of engineers. We went out on the streets, we had buckets of kind of gypsum, and we were literally drawing on the ground what we'd just been drawing on paper. This kind of like show what's possible. And at the end of finishing it all, the Commissioner of Transportation came out and he kind of stood there with me at the intersection. I was still quite new in my job, so I was pretty nervous about how this was all going, And he kind of looked at me and said, like, you've taken a lot of space away from the cars. Like, what's going on here? I was like, well, Commissioner, it's, the reality is in your city, and this was a huge intersection. I was like, over 80% of your population are people that walk and take transit, and, only 4% of the population drive. And I said, 88% of your fatalities are people dying on the streets, like pedestrians. And I was like, they need this space, so to shorten the crossings. And I was like, and look, and like a bus, kind of came and still could make, very easily make the turn. And he kind of stood silently. And meanwhile, I'm like sweating and like stressing that I'm, still going to have a job at the end of the day. And he looked at me and he said, so why is this not permanent? And I was just like, amazing, And so it was amazing because that seeing is believing. We then got the kind of permits to do like a 6-month interim trial. We worked with local artists, did the paint, and then we could collect all the metrics as well, quantitative and qualitative, to show the impact. They then went back and made it permanent and scaled it up to a citywide program.
Yeah. And you're on the right track when they start asking about the next set of questions. So, then it becomes, right? It's not just about the paint, but how fast you can build the paint, which is,
exactly
another set of questions, another podcast for another day.
Keep the conversation going.
Yeah. They don't like the color of the planters, right? And then you really wanna...
I've had many of those conversations. Colors of the planters. That means they're in. The buy-in's there. So if we're having conversations about planters. Just curious if you can get a little bit more into Latin America examples. In Latin America, a lot of those countries have been following our lead for quite some time since you left, and so you've been leading those conversations. So can you share a little bit more, about what public realm changes are happening in Latin American cities?
One of my favorites in Latin America is Fortaleza. And I bring them up because I think, again, I was just there a few months ago and seeing they've been doing this work now for coming on a decade. And so you can really see the change that they've kind of institutionalized and been able to carry across, political administrations. And they had a first lady back in the day who was really about kids' priorities as well. So they've got like bike share for kids in Fortaleza. They've got these like little mini plazas throughout, the city for small children. And so they've kind of taken this really like coordinated approach that I think is quite rare in cities. It's so often each discipline sits in their own silo, and they've taken this kind of, approach where now they've got incredible cycle networks, they've got improved public spaces, and you can just feel the difference in the city. And they were actually one of the few cities in the world that met the UN SDG goal of halving road traffic fatalities. It's now 2030, but it was 2020, the goal for them. And they were one of about 3 cities in the world that met that goal by 2020. So it's pretty colors, it's paint, it's feel-good stuff for the kids, but it is life and death as well. Like they are saving lives drastically. So really impressive work coming out of there as well.
Amazing.
Yeah, I want to build on some of the points you're making about embedding, institutionalizing, scaling up. Mm-hmm. You guys are thinking about some innovative strategies, kind of moving beyond just individual projects. Can you talk a little bit about what you're thinking in terms of really creating these types of changes culturally in the long term?
It's such a critical question, right? Like, what are the different ingredients that go into that deeper systemic change? And how can we help these things not be one-liners? How can they, like you guys have done really well in New York, right? Like be able to kind of survive through different mayors, different political administrations to still show that this stuff is critical. And I think part of that is obviously getting the projects on the ground, collecting the right data, and having the local precedents to point to, because everybody says, right, New York back in the day said, we're not Copenhagen. Now everybody says, we're not New York. We can't do that. And having something locally with at least some community members who understand the impact and the data, the metrics to show what's possible really is critical component of getting over that first really big hump, right? But also, updating the street design manuals, changing the policies, getting the speed limit reductions down, and kind of institutionalizing these types of projects and transformations in the day-to-day operational budgets of the city, so that it's when something needs to be repaired, it's built back better, or that line's painted slightly in a different place, even if it might not cost any more. So it really is kind of a combination of different factors. I think that we have to embrace that complexity to really institutionalize change.
Yeah.
That was awesome. I mean, I'm just loving the global insight here, which just only gives me and Emily confirmation what we're doing is right. But just wanted to ask you, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the difference. You've done a lot of work here, and you traveled the world, and so New York City has a great public transit system. A lot of folks, a lot of our people rely on that. But you've traveled to major cities that don't have that public transit system. So how has your work actually enhanced transportation, transit, connectivity, and connecting folks to where they need to go every single day?
There's a bunch of cities that I think are quite similar to New York, but there's ones that I think are quite different, right? I mean, I think I was just, a couple of weeks ago in PCMC, Pimpri-Chinchwad in India. That's a kind of a project around a 15-minute city approach that the city is working on, and we're supporting them on. But they don't have the public transport infrastructure there in that case that you can fall back on. And we're trying to focus on cycling in that case, right? But we're also trying to say, you need to do the cycling infrastructure really well, because if you don't protect that space, and look, we're biking around the neighborhood as we go, saying, look, there's a car parked in that cycle facility that's just a painted line. You're never going to get a kid or a caregiver out on that facility. And so we were lucky. We were visiting a stretch where they had just freshly painted, just the painted line. This gets a bit geeky, but they were looking at that 1.5 meters to be within a 6 meter to travel lane, basically 20 feet of space. And I was like, well, hang on a second. We got some chalk out of our pocket and said, well, actually, if we just take this extra 50 centimeters over here or a foot, or so, and we drew it down and we kind of sketched up a buffer and we got a, Jersey barrier and put it on the street and said, look, actually, the cars are still moving. And, so sometimes we're talking about big spatial reclamation, but sometimes it's also finding opportunities for little nuggets of space that can, again, show what's possible and unlock and say, it works. And look, this is going to be safer. Yes, it's taking space away from vehicles, but we're trying to help people understand that most people in those places can't afford a car. So why are we looking at shaping a future for them where their only option is to drive?
Yeah.
We ask every guest what their biggest breach of transportation transit etiquette is, and I want to pose that question to you.
Yeah. I do. It sounds funny. I do miss my New York City commute. I was there for 15 years. I think, gosh, I mean, I never loved a big backpack on a crowded train. That was always a little frustrating with the kind of, swing that took you out unexpectedly.
Agreed.
Is never that fun. But probably one of my other pet peeves is when you can see somebody sitting down and they see someone who needs a seat and then they pretend that they haven't seen them and they keep looking down on their phone. That makes me that makes me a little frustrated. So
Skye, what are you most enthusiastic about the future of transportation?
I must say, I mean, I think the kids lens is just really, really powerful. I'm super excited about, scaling that thinking and that work, because I think it's something that, again, in a really difficult political environment in most parts of the world, it doesn't matter if you're left or right or centrist, or it doesn't matter what color your tie is, so many people can relate to kids. And I think, if we can institutionalize that approach to consider that perspective, if we could ask ourselves that question of how could we make this better for a child? And we've got hundreds, then thousands, then hopefully millions of people doing that. I'm very optimistic that we can take, some pretty amazing places already and just make them that much better and that much more fun and joyous and spaces that foster love and adventure and crazy things that we don't typically talk about in our profession. But I think we should probably talk about it a little bit more.
I love that. Spaces that develop love, because that's certainly something that we're doing here in New York, and that's something that you're doing around the world. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all of your expertise, sharing your stories, Skye. It's so reassuring knowing that you are tirelessly doing all of this fantastic work all over the globe. And we'll see you out there in another time zone soon.
Good to see you.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. This was so much fun. And yeah, look forward to catching up again soon.